I want to welcome everybody to a new episode of On Air. So for the last 2 months, starting at the end of January, we've been doing the Glyph residency, which has been this incredible experience, very unique to anything that we've done before, where a new artist is coming every week to respond to the environment and this really amazing idea that Beatriz Cortez proposed and then invited these amazing artists to be a part of. So it's been so much fun and such a dynamic experience to watch our outdoor sculpture trail transform with each artist. And then next week, our final artist is joining us, Candice Lynn. And also happening next week is our on-air episode where all 6 of the Glyph artists will be coming together in a roundtable conversation about everything that they've been doing during their residencies and their interpretation of the Glyph and their response to it. So very exciting. Tune in next week for that. And if you have not yet had the opportunity to come see the work, we are open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from 2 to 5. And Doreen will share a link to sign up for to come visit. And it's really great because it's all outside. It will be great for social distancing, getting outdoors, doing a little bit of a hike. Our hill is quite a killer for the non-experienced hikers like me. So that is always super wonderful. So now I would love to introduce our very special guest, Pavithra Prasad. So she is our current artist in residence for Glyph, and Pavi will be sharing more about her work and giving us a super special glimpse into the soundscapes that she is creating for her performances this week. So let me give a little bit of an introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Pavi. But if you have questions, we have the Q&A, we have the chat, post it all in there so that Pavi would love to kind of interact with you guys. So please do any questions. We're so open. So now, Pavi is a writer, scholar, and performer working at the intersection of text, voice, sound, and performance art. Born and raised in Chennai in South India, her aesthetic engages decolonial forms of narrative, music, composition, and language praxis. Her mixed method research and performance map South Asian futurism and global anti-racist coalition. She has done ethnographic work and psychedelic subculture in India, which informs and ignites the cultural criticism embedded in her creative work. She has shown her work in India and the United States and holds a PhD in performance studies from Northwestern University and teaches at the California State University in Northridge. So Pavi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for this talk and for you to share more about it. If you have questions about the performance, Pavi will tell you more. Otherwise, at the end, any questions you have on how to access and interact with the work will be more explained. So Pavi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Husha, and thank you for inviting me here. Big thanks goes to Beatriz Cortez, who has been so instrumental in developing this vision for this show, and all of the other artists have been so inspirational to a lot of what I'm doing while I'm here at Lux. So thank you all for bringing me here and for being so supportive in making this vision come to life. And I will tell you more about that in just a minute. Thanks also to Stephanie and Doreen, who have helped with the setup and the sharing of this work, and particularly this episode. So thank you so much for your support as well. And I want to begin not at the beginning, because a lot of what I'm doing right now with sound and text and voice eschews an originary point. I'm not interested in origin stories, and yet I'm compelled to introduce myself in that way. So I want to give you a little bit of a background of how I came to this music, but I'm trying to erase the linearity of that narrative. So I might go back and forth a little bit and do a little hopping around in terms of temporality. So I hope you'll bear with me as that actually captures what I'm trying to do with the sound installations I'm creating for Lux. I began thinking of myself as a musician, perhaps 10 years in the future. That time has not yet come, even though I have been playing music and singing since I can remember. I was born and raised in India, in South India, and part of the culture for a certain caste of people in southern India is to study some form of music, be it instrumental, voice, or maybe dance. And part of the dance training is also studying music. And music and dance and movement are very deeply intertwined in my training in Indian classical music, South Indian classical music, known as Carnatic music. And I studied this for most of my young life, my young adult life, till I was about 16, from the time that I was about 3. So started very young and kept studying it all the way until high school. And I was never very good, to tell you the truth. I was okay. And I think there were a lot more performers and even people my own age who had a command over the theory of the music and the nuances of how you would compose, improvise, and even understand ragas or scales and what was happening in the music, things that just somehow escaped me. And a part of this was because I just didn't have the mind for that kind of detail, and I was a very unruly and undisciplined child. But I really loved music and I loved to sing, and it never really became part of my practice to develop virtuosity in the music. I felt like I was just doing what felt good to me and what felt meaningfully genuine. I use that word hesitantly because I don't think that there is such a thing that you can measure what is genuine and what isn't, but it felt really good and it felt like me. And I remember performing in public my first solo concert. It's kind of like a coming out debutante moment for a young performer. And I remember asking one of my teachers at the end of the concert, like, how did it go? And they said, you need more practice. And I was so appalled. And it didn't, however, encourage me to keep developing virtuosity. In fact, I started to become more rhizomatic in how I played music. So I would borrow a lot from Carnatic music while I was singing Whitney Houston, for example, which I learned by listening to cassette tapes in my bedroom, cassette tapes that were brought back by relatives or friends who had traveled abroad. And this was before we had satellite TV and transnational communication technologies. And so I would listen to these cassette tapes and learn how to sing in that style from listening to different artists. And so a lot of the practice that I have developed and that has come to you now in this form is a pastiche of various styles, none of which are truly virtuosic. And that's what I'm dealing with right now. This idea of producing, playing, and creating sound that's not necessarily musical, but still has some of those qualities. It's not noise per se. There's noise art, but that's not exactly what I'm doing. So it's a sort of collection of affects, collection of experiences, sense memories, feelings, and gaps as well. And those gaps become important. What is missing from this? What is missing from the history of how I'm playing this music? And I'm talking a lot about virtuosity because I think it has a lot to do with migration, oddly enough. Some of you who have really gotten into classical music or studying music or musicians yourselves know that there's a great emphasis on verisimilitude, that is producing music that is very close to the notation, practicing so that it sounds the same as when it has been played by a better musician, or your teacher, or how you've heard it on a record. And so the virtuosity is, in my mind, geared towards producing a certain kind of sameness, right? A reproducibility, a repeatability, with difference, with variation. But in performance, there's the script, right? The notation of music, which I cannot read. I don't read music, sheet music, Western classical sheet music, or Indian classical notation very well. And so I found myself feeling, as many of us do, this is just beyond me. Like, I can't be a musician. Maybe one day, 10 years from now, I could be, but not right now. And I slowly realized that that's not going to happen. My practice was not becoming more virtuosic. I wasn't getting better necessarily. And this I had a moment when I realized that this musical practice was running quite in parallel with my immigrant experience. I moved to the United States when I was 18, just at the cusp of 17 and 18. And the overwhelming changes and the cultural adaptation that I had to face at that time were extremely challenging, not painful, but just overwhelming. Not always painful, I should say. There were some painful moments, but very overwhelming. And the expectation was to be virtuosic, to prove one way or another that you're either assimilating or that you are preserving your culture, preserving your identity, by not changing, or changing enough to become part of this new society. And that tension between assimilation and preservation is what defines musical notation for me. We notate music in order to preserve it. And so that there is some form of assimilation that happens when a musician reads the sheet music and tries to play that music. So this parallel that I started to feel very, in an embodied way, feel very much connected to, was this tension between virtuosity and amateurness, however we want to define those things, as a parallel experience of migration and becoming a musician. And this has been sort of the defining foundation of my musical practice and my performance practice that is attendant to that. I think I have always considered myself first and foremost a musical artist before a performance artist. I came to performance art, narrative performance, text-based, script-based performance, all through music. And most of my work has originated in this moment. Again, I said no ordinary stories, but here it is. Originated in a moment of musical experience. A song that I heard or a melody that spoke to me resonated. And what I'm trying to do with these pieces that I'm creating for Lux, which will be situated along the campus, along the walkways as you move through the campus and view the other artists' work, this is in collaboration or in conversation with some of those other works and with the environment of Lux's campus, which is beautiful and scenic and just idyllic in many ways. So what does this idyllic, serene environment have to do with this sense of tension that is present in my music making or sound making practice? One of the things too that I wanted to touch upon is this idea then that if a migrant body is producing certain sounds that captures their history, they're producing sound as a form of narrative, a sound that reflects the environment, reflects the space that we're in, and also reflects the space in which it's being generated. So it's not just a reflection, it's bringing the space and constituting the music and the space simultaneously. And because we're aware of, because especially I'm really aware of how unstable my own identitarian narrative is. Am I Indian? I mean, what is my identity? I've lived in the United States much longer than I have in India, but what is the sense of preservation of culture? You know, like, what is it that I'm trying to preserve? What is it that any of us as immigrants is trying to preserve? Is it a virtuosic performance of either belonging to your culture of origin or a virtuosic performance of assimilating to the culture that you are living in now? And I've just come to this point in my practice where I am doing away with virtuosity altogether. I've written about this with ethnomusicologists, particularly Jeff Roy. We have a piece on virtuosity as a reflection of a colonialist impulse, the need to categorize and codify and contain and discipline. And so virtuosity to me has always been a form of discipline that is not appealing. And I have done away with it in my practice. And what I'm trying to do instead is not preservation, but resurrection. What are some of the ways, the narratives that have been lost that we don't talk about in terms of identity and migration? The things that are a little sticky and uncomfortable, I want to resurrect those. Things like language loss. I would say that I'm fluent in my mother tongue, which is Tamil, but I've lost a lot of it over the last 21 years that I've been here. Lost language. I've lost tuning, the way that I listen to and can improvise certain kinds of Indian music. But there are traces, you know, there's a kind of ghosting that happens where you're somewhat aware of these things that are lingering in the back rooms of your mind palace, if you will. And those specters that kind of knock every now and then on the front part of your brain are the ones that I want to listen to at this moment. And so I'm trying to resurrect those things that have been lost, or those things that are in the back rooms that we rarely talk about in terms of identity and identitarian performance. Because identitarian performance, again, in many ways is about that preservation, is about a kind of virtuosic belonging, or acquiring that, right? Acquiring language, becoming fluent again is a kind of performance of that virtuosity of this is who you are, right? This is who you really are. You're recovering your roots. We hear that a lot. Finding your roots again, which are all so important to our sense of being in the world. But I'm questioning what is a futurist orientation towards identity. What can we do with moving away from stability, moving towards non-linearity, moving towards atemporality, and doing what I think I would call a kind of time travel, bouncing back and forth between your past, your present, and your potential future. And so this is a very expansive way of thinking about what I'm trying to do with the sound that I'm creating. So I know it might sound a bit esoteric, but that's how I'm approaching my playing of a particular instrument, which I've picked up recently and I'm not virtuosic at, and it's the theremin. All of the instruments that I play, I have taught myself, including voice as an instrument. A lot of the styles that I sing now, I have taught myself. And so I'm thinking about the theremin here, and I came to this through my research on psychedelic subcultures and electronic music, and ended up really fascinated with the theremin. And I took a class once with a really famous theremin player, Carolina Eck. And it really changed my mind, changed my view of how we make music, because the theremin responds not to your manipulations. It responds in the way that it wants in relation to your body. And I'll show you what that means in just a few minutes. But I want to say this is a peculiar instrument for this reason. It defies virtuosity. It tells you essentially, you can try to control me, but it is going to be very, very difficult. And so when I see excellent theremin players who are just amazing virtuosic players, the way that they move is very controlled, and there's so much tension in maintaining that that perfectly verisimilitudinous, I think I'm saying that right, production of sound. So they're playing a song, for example, and you're trying to recognize what is that sound, because the theremin doesn't sound like an instrument that can capture melody exactly. So you hear it for some time and you go, oh, wait, oh, that's Over the Rainbow, or oh, that's Peer Gynt. Like I can recognize the song, but it takes a minute. And so even the most virtuosic theremin players are engaged in a sort of reproduction of verisimilitude, process of verisimilitude. And what I am trying to do here is allow the theremin to respond to me, and I will respond to the theremin. So my playing is organic. It is not scripted. It's very improvisatory and atemporal. I don't keep beat. I don't try to. I mean, if it happens, it happens. But the idea of disciplining the relationship between the body and the instrument is something that I don't think about when I play the theremin, unlike when I play the guitar, or unlike when I sing, which is a kind of control of your voice instrument. And this allows us to really experience a kind of liberation. And again, I feel like a lot of this becomes a metaphor for my own experience as an immigrant, and which is what Glyph is trying to capture. This whole exhibition and all the works that the artists are making here are about this sort of connection to something that we could have been, or we may be in the future, and that we are possibly now. There's a certain ineffability to a lot of the works in the exhibition. And that's what I'm responding to as well. These are signatures, they're images, they're fragments, they're ephemera that come together to create a vision of what this transnational, cultural, intercultural, collaborative art-making process could be like. And the theremin seemed to me a very appropriate instrument to capture that experience. For me personally, as someone who is exploring that tension between stable identity and completely destabilized, fragmentary, orbital, extraterrestrial identity, and that are not concerned with terrestrial political matters, right? Like you're identifying against some of these controlling colonial mechanisms. So that's part of the decolonial process, and also to think about the theremin as a autonomous entity in the exhibition, even though the theremin as an instrument is not going to be present on scene. The sounds that it produces are going to recall its presence in that way. So without further ado, let me just talk you through what the theremin is. So I'm going to take my computer over, and many of you might know this already, so I'm just trying to demonstrate this for those who might be encountering this for the first time. So here's this instrument. And again, part of the non-virtuosic performance of the theremin means that I use this little device, which is not a classic theremin, but a Moog Theremin. So it actually comes modified to produce very good sound without trying very hard. So I'm taking all the help that I can get. I have a handicap here. And that is, part of also allowing my experience as an artist and also as an immigrant to take help. We often resist that. We punish ourselves by saying we've got to be good and put in our 10,000 hours and become really good. And I really want to experience pleasure much faster. And I think we all deserve to experience pleasure much faster than we allow ourselves usually. And so I'm using the Theremin instead of a classic Theremin. I'm going to turn on my amp. It's going to be really loud, and I will talk you through it. So this is the pitch antenna. So I play the melody on this scale, and I play it by manipulating the air around the antenna. So if I move, the closer I get to the antenna, the higher the pitch. The further I get away, the lower. And the theremin is calibrated to my body, so it responds to my particular alignment. So if someone else were to step in here, it will sound different. On this side is the volume control. So I use this hand to manipulate how loud it gets and when I mute the sound. So I'm just going to play for you a little bit. I have a looper, which I use to make the kind of the fabric of the sound and weave things together. So I'll just play a little bit for you, and then we can talk afterwards. what it is. And that's just a sample. I play around with it a lot to create better orchestrated fabrics. Sometimes it's unexpected, what comes out. And I'm happy to take more questions. Thank you so much all. Thank you all for being here. It's really such a pleasure to share this with you. It's something that I'm really enjoying, and what is pleasure if you can't share it with others? So thank you so much for coming and listening and being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Pavi. That's so awesome. I love this instrument so much, and watching you play, the gestures are just incredible, which is actually one of my questions. But everybody, if you have questions for Pavi, please put them in the Q&A. So I want to start off kind of asking you my question. It's like multiple layers. So because I think what you're saying about assimilation and preservation when it comes to music and immigration is such a beautiful concept, and to make those connections. And I'm really interested, you talked a little bit about language, but I think you use language in your performances as well. So I was wondering, how do you think language ties into this idea of assimilation and preservation, but not just verbal language, but also body language, especially because you're so expressive and there's so much in a gesture that's also very culturally distinguished as well. So I'm curious kind of how you think about language, body language, and the gesture.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. I think a lot about what I don't know anymore in terms of even bodily movement. So there's a way in which we code switch all the time as cultural beings, depending on what environment we in, what situation we're in. And I feel like I've almost developed multiple versions of the same language, not just dialect, but completely different languages. So when I'm speaking to my family or my friends in India, the entire body affect changes. It's not just the language. And the language, of course, is also inflected by loss, because many of us, including my friends, cannot string a full sentence together without English in it, in our mother tongues. Yeah. So some of that is there. And then we have the body, which is physically resisting certain sounds, for example, and the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we inflect certain sentences are not just cognitive, but they're also deeply subconscious, So I think language operates on that primal level, and not always how we think of it as a function of our evolution as great, like evolved creatures who have developed this articulate way of communicating through language. For what you're asking, I think signals that that language is so deeply buried. It's kind of like the snake and the glyph, it's slithering underground, and it's there, and it's shifting, and it's moving the earth around it as it's moving, but it's not just a thing on its own. It's also moving our bodies. Going back to the question about language, the body, and immigration, it's that thing. Language becomes a sort of demonic presence almost, that shames us and says, you've lost me. You've lost pieces of me. You don't speak as well as you should. And your body complies. There's a way that text becomes hegemonic, and script language becomes hegemonic. And that's something that I think all immigrants have an experience of, whether it's fighting to preserve language and trying to practice it and speak it as much as possible, or feeling a deep sense of shame of having lost it completely.
Yeah, I think a lot of your identity is, or at least for me personally, I feel like a lot of my identity is tied into my ability to continue to speak my first language and my mother language, and like the fear of not being able to do that as kind of a loss of that identity, more so than my other, cultural markers.
Yeah, I completely understand. And I feel like that is that's such a sort of hurtful thing we do to ourselves also. Not that it isn't good to retain your language, but when we don't, there's such a emotional violence associated with that. And that is what I'm identifying as virtuosity too. It's like, virtuosity is not just being good at something. It has a social value. It's demonstrating something to other people. It's producing social value for you as a person, social capital. So it's not this innocent way of saying I'm really good at something. It also becomes a sort of disciplining mechanism.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is kind of a roundabout way of talking about what you asked, but I think that's the relationship between language, our embodied experience of it, and our refusal of our bodies to comply sometimes. We were talking about the R's right before this started, and that's one of those things, like even my own name sounds strange in my mouth sometimes because I'm like, am I rolling the R correctly? Is that how you say my name?
Yeah, I feel that too. I'm so used to people now mispronouncing my name that sometimes I don't remember if I pronounced it correctly or not. So I'm gonna get to the questions from our viewers. Do you think that originality can be achieved without being virtuous? And how does that affect your inspiration? Does virtuosity affect originality?
That question, I think it's such a great question, because I think a lot of people would disagree with me when I say you don't need to be virtuosic in order to be original. Originality is easy when you don't have virtuosity, because anything you do is going to sound not unlike, or it's going to sound unlike something someone else has already played or created, because it is wholly dependent on not producing verisimilitude. But I think I'm not dissing virtuosity or people who cultivate it, because I think that originality within the form is always possible, by learning and understanding it so well that you are liberated within it, and then you start to improvise and create extraordinarily original work, is obviously possible. And so I don't think that originality is split off from virtuosity, but it's two ends of the spectrum, right? I think where we lose originality is that middle portion where we're just trying to reproduce what the record sounds like. We're just trying to reproduce what academic writing, for example, looks like, because we've read something and we're trying to imitate it. So that's that portion where I think originality can die. But the other two ends of it, the further you go towards virtuosity, I think the more opportunities there are to be truly original. And in the opposite direction, when you just do away with virtuosity altogether, and you're not interested, sometimes produces some of the most amazing sonic art that I've heard, where I'm like, you definitely don't know how to play the clarinet, but you're doing something really interesting that's fun to listen to, and that's evocative and moving. I listened to this artist just a few days ago called Claudio, and she's an electronic musical artist, and she's a one-person band. And also Imogen Heap, whom I'm a huge fan of. The way that they're using sort of built soundscapes to create original works is really profound. They're not imitating, they're not producing anything recognizable, you know? So virtuosity for me is about recognizability. I recognize this melody, it's being played beautifully, and then there's this original take on it. So the further away you go from originality, the less recognizable it becomes. And sometimes that's when we think that's the only way that originality is possible, when we don't cite or signal to something else. But, you know, I think it's both ends of the spectrum produce original work.
The next question, can you expand on your expression about feeling like music is like time traveling? Would you say that if you had stayed permanently in your place of origin, that you would have been affected with which, or if that would have affected which instrument you would try to play?
That's a fantastic question. I think it's hard to tell what could have happened, right? But I think that I was doing this already when I was in India and growing up there. I resisted becoming good at Carnatic music because I just felt like, oh my God, you're asking me to become good by becoming the same. And so I picked up, yes, you know, some part of it was also just trying new things. So I picked up the guitar when I was still living in India. And it was a counterpoint to my Indian classical training. But I also picked up the veena, which is a string instrument, after I moved to the US. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but this ability to time travel is not just backwards and forwards in along a temporal line, but it's also across spaces, right? So the playing the veena in the United States, having picked it up at a later age, produces a different narrative of who I am than it would have if I'd picked it up, you know, when my grandmother was playing it, and she could have taught me in India, you know, and she has, and we've played together since. And in fact, it was that instrument that got me thinking about virtuosity, because I'm like, I'm never going to be good at this. It would take, you know, decades of practice to be very, very good. But I get how this works because I played the guitar, and it's another string instrument. And so this sort of, it's border traveling. It's a sort of dimensional traveling, relational practice, right? So I think about time in this nonlinear way, that it's more about the multiverse, like what could have been, right? And you're exploring those what could have been moments at different points in your life, but they could have all happened. They're all happening right now. I hope that explains it, but that's just how my unruly mind would explain the answer to your question.
I love it. We're getting into the multiverse.
We're bound to go there. You know,
of course, I love it. I want to answer the question of why the theremin, and does picking up this instrument represent the transition and transmission of the fluidity of migration?
Yes, in short, yes. That's what drew me to the theremin, because it really felt like such an invitational instrument, a way of playing music that was so democratic. You didn't even have to touch the instrument, you just had to be around it and it would respond to you. And it was such an inviting instrument to me, something that I think we all want to experience as immigrants, you know, being welcomed, being responded to. And there was something and goes back to the question you asked, Husha, about, you know, what is the relationship between language and the body and sound and text? And this is it, because there's some things that escape language, that your body experiences affectively, that just cannot be translated. And I think this is one of them, where when I first encountered the theremin, I was like, wow, this could get really annoying sonically, right? Because we go, just keeps going, and it is an acquired taste. But there was something about playing the instrument versus just listening to it that felt like coming home. It felt like, I feel like I'm home here, and yet I've never been here before. It's that kind of time travel, like that sort of layering of realities. And so thank you for asking that question, because I hadn't really put it into words yet, why the theremin felt like such an emotionally resonant instrument to me. And this is why, because I was like, wow, I mean, I've tried other instruments like the kazoo, which also felt similar. I was trying to capture that experience of what is it like to play an instrument that is not going to judge you. And the kazoo was great, but you have to be a somewhat okay singer to play the kazoo. So I felt like that was cheating. The theremin was completely new in that there are a handful of people across the world who can actually play the theremin really, really well. So everyone is an amateur when they're playing the theremin. And there was something very like Brave New World about it, like in the sense that there are no scripts here about how to be good, how to be virtuosic, how to assimilate, how to preserve. Like there was just no script. It was such an open field. And traveling through that field was part of the experience of this music rather than what the music sounded like. So it's a very process heavy experience that I had with the theremin. And that's the experience that immigrants have on either end of this is who I used to be and this is who I am now, those definitional utterances of identity. There's a whole process in between that just never gets spoken. And for me, the theremin really captures that unspoken terrain.
I love that. That's such an amazing answer. So our next question is kind of a continuation of this. Do you feel like the theremin works to preserve your past and your culture?
Yes, in that it preserves that curious child. It preserves that child that was raised in a culture that allowed for a lot of things to be possible. And that's a cultural experience that I don't think is the same now. I mean, there's the rise of Hindu fundamentalist right-wing fascism in India right now, in a way that I don't think in the ways that I was queer, the ways that I, just didn't really perform gender the way that I was supposed to, didn't perform my cultural heritage, become the vessel of tradition that a lot of women identified folks feel the burden of, right? Like we're supposed to be the preservers of culture, and I was just not doing that. And so there's something about that past that the theremin really helps me hold on to, and that is a culture that I think I have a little bit of nostalgia for, and maybe it's misplaced nostalgia because obviously I don't live there anymore and it's difficult to know. But I do know that some aspects of how I play the theremin is in the way that you're asking. Like, yes, it recalls certain melodic structures, certain scales, ragas that I'm drawn to, that are just imprinted on my mind, that are cultural experiences for sure. But the larger cultural recollection that the theremin enables is this other thing that defies those identitarian boundaries of what are the markers of my Indianness. There's these unspoken, unregistered markers, like the ability to be queer in the 80s, that wasn't regulated in the way that it is now. That's also a cultural experience that I think the theremin runs in parallel to. So thank you for asking that question. I think that's really gives me lots of things to think about, like what are the anchors of culture that I've now attached to the theremin. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pavi. That was actually our last question. So as a reminder for everybody, you'll be able to come to Lux and hear these soundscapes embedded in the landscape across Lux's campus. And then there will be links to videos that are gestural and linguistic interpretations or reactions to those soundscapes. So it's a multi-platform, multi-dimensional performance. So yes, come check it out. And next week, if you would like to hear more from Pavi and the other artists, join us for our episode next week. And then Pavi, thank you so much. This was an amazing talk. I absolutely love it. The way that you approach it is such a unique and beautiful perspective. And thank you so much for sharing that. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm so excited that you played for us. That was beautiful.
Thank you all so much. I'm really I'm blissed out right now getting to share this new work with you. I mean, this is the first time I've really talked about this work in this way. So I really appreciate having your support and your audience.
All right, everybody. I will see you next week and have a wonderful rest of your day.